So good day, friends. This is Dr. Bob Hamilton, and you have tuned in today to the Hamilton Review, where kids and culture collide. Your presence today, listening to this podcast, means a lot to me. I know that each of you who tune in have families, who have friends, you have things that you're doing. You're going shopping, you're going to the bank, you're chasing kids, you're driving them all over the place. I know that. And so the fact that you are making time to be here means a lot to me. So thank you for that. If you like what you hear, I hope you do. Share it with friends, share it with family. We're building an audience. And the reason I tell people to share this podcast is because I, on a weekly basis, bring to you, I find these people all out there in the world, but I find fascinating people. And today is no exception for sure. It's a pleasure to welcome to our podcast today, Trey Dimsdale. Trey, welcome to the Hamilton Review.
Thanks for inviting me.
Absolutely. So just as a brief introduction, and then I'm going to have Trey give a more definitive background on him. But Trey is the founder and the executive director of an organization, a think tank called the Center for Religion, Culture, and Democracy. That's a long name, Trey. He has an undergraduate degree, essentially in poli-science, and he also has a law degree from the University of Missouri in Kansas City, and he also has a master's degree in theological ethics from Southwestern Seminary, which is in Fort Worth, Texas. So Trey Dimsdale comes to us today with incredible credentials, and Trey, it's such a pleasure to have you. So I like to have my guest take kind of step back and tell the listeners a little bit about you and your background, your journey in life, how you ended up doing what you're doing, the inflection points that would cause you, that impulse that would cause you to found an organization like the Center for Religion, Culture, and Democracies. Trey, I'm going to turn the microphone over to you, and you can take it from there.
Yeah, so thanks so much again. I'm honored to have been invited to share a little bit today. I'm married, have one son. We live in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, which is where the headquarters of the center is. And my pathway to this is pretty circuitous. We do a lot of programs with college students, and I will get questions from a lot of them about, like, how do I get your job? And the answer is, I don't know. I ultimately don't know. I've just been very, very fortunate to have exposure to the things I've had exposure to and opportunities that I've had. I actually went to college intending partway through college. I actually was intending to study medicine, honestly. And I was accepted into a post-bac pre-med program, a competitive post-bac pre-med program, one of these ones where you finish a year and you're guaranteed admission to the medical school that's attached to the university.
Sure.
And to be honest with you, in retrospect, the reason I didn't ultimately finish it is it was really a lack of self-confidence. I thought, I would rather just not do this than to attempt it and not succeed. And so my undergraduate degree, you mentioned, was in political science. Like the school also had a minor in the history of medicine. And so I knew, I'm interested in the world of ideas, and I was just sort of scattered. If I wasn't going to be going off and practicing medicine, it was okay, well, it's something in the world of ideas. And I misunderstood really what law school was about. I loved the law as an academic discipline once I got there. And I got really, really bad advice from a judge that I was a clerk for. He's a phenomenal person. He's retired now. And he said, if I were, I enjoy being a judge. I've enjoyed practicing law, but if I really wanted to make a difference in the world, I would have become a minister.
Wow.
So, and professional people. I mean, it's a little bit easier, obviously, for people to make a a connection between how you, being a pediatrician, actually help people on a day-to-day basis, than thinking of how a lawyer or a judge helps people on a day-to-day basis. But I thought, well, this guy is like at the pinnacle of the profession. He's had a successful career. He must know what he's talking about. He's a fine Christian man. So I ended up foregoing traditional law practice or practicing directly out of a clerkship to go. That's how I ended up at a seminary getting a master's degree. And it was once I was on the campus and I began to do some work for an embedded think tank that did work with regard to sort of like a Christian view of the world,
Yeah.
that I really started to get engaged with, the larger questions of, what are the foundational sort of assumptions of society? How do we maintain Western civilization and things like that? And so that was actually my first foray into working in the think tank world.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. So you said this foundational assumptions, I guess. What are some of the things that you discovered there at the seminary in terms of
well,
foundational assumptions? Because I think this is something that I ponder a lot too.
yeah. So I think there's a couple of different ways you can look at that. I mean, obviously, we're both Christians, so we see the world, through a unique lens, but it's not a lens that's incompatible with a person who, approaches the world from a different religious perspective or even no religious perspective. We just sort of have a little bit more meat on the bones, coming from a Christian perspective, and I think that there are two things that Christians bring into the public square that are unique.
Yeah.
One is our view of the human person. So all throughout history, people were viewed as property, or they were viewed as members of groups, but not as individuals. There's a book that came out several years ago called "Inventing the Individual," in which a secular scholar teaches at Cambridge named Larry Siedentop makes the argument that Christianity actually invented, the Apostle Paul, quote unquote, invented the concept of the individual.
Oh.
And he's not writing from a Christian perspective, but he's writing from like a philosophical perspective, or historical perspective, that Christianity injected into the marketplace of ideas an idea that just simply had not existed. And so our recognition of the intrinsic value of the individual is one thing that Christians bring to the table that's unique to our particular worldview. But then also our unique appreciation for authority as opposed to power.
Hmm. Okay.
So we look at, like, obviously Jesus Christ himself, that possessed the power that, that as God, that he voluntarily set aside to become man. And he taught with authority. When he died, he left, at most 100 followers that ultimately turned the world upside down. And the church is always at its best when it is speaking with authority, that authority that is borrowed from Scripture, borrowed from Christ himself, rather than trying to jump up on the stage and grab the reins of power and pull it in one direction or another. This is sort of like the prophetic mission of Christians in the church and the world, is to sort of be the conscience.
Yeah.
There's an author who talks about the church as being, quote unquote, the soul of the world. And there's a lot of latitude in trying to figure out how to solve social problems when we're talking about the way that we hash things out in the public square and political discourse. There's lots of ways to order a society in which all people can flourish, but Christians should, regardless of the society in which they bring, be a mouthpiece for those things. And so that whatever policies that political actors may come up with are things that sort of respect the individual and take seriously the moral claims that we would bring.
Yeah, to the culture. You know, I'm thinking about you didn't mention the word truth, but I think that truth is something that, you know, you speak truth to power, and I think that is what you mean by the authority, that sense of authority. I mean, Christ, when he went around, he certainly spoke with great authority, and he had he put people in their places. He actually,
Hmm.
you know, he said things that were like sometimes not that nice. When you kind of stand back and go, that wasn't nice. It was a little bit, you know, you kind of go, what's that all about? But he spoke truth, and truth can be looked at as being not nice. I mean, there are certain things that we do as Christians. We do hold this idea of the individual is infinitely worthwhile, and that each individual in this world has got a calling from God to do something unique and special in this world. And I think that is certainly deep in my heart, and I believe that with all my heart. And when you see power dismissing people, you can speak to authority about that. I mean, this is one of the things,
Right.
certainly in the area of, like, for example, abortion. I mean, it's something that's a topic that I kind of came to the party a little bit late on. I didn't really understand the issue, to be honest with you. But when you actually talk about abortion, you can, honestly, you can speak authority to power, because the power is certainly, and the money, by the way, is certainly in that court. But you can speak, you know, truth that this is a human being, and a real tangible, unique human being. And so that's something that a lot of times power certainly doesn't always like truth. And I think we see that all around the world, certainly
Absolutely.
in
Absolutely.
cultures that are what can I say? Tyrannies especially do not like truth, and that's why tyrannies typically try to quell and quash and smash anybody who stands up and speaks truth to their authority,
Yeah.
or to their power. Put it that way. Okay, so this is interesting. So those are some of the foundational truths that you kind of walked away from your master's education there at Southwestern Seminary. What and when did this whole Center for Religion, Culture, and Democracy, how did that come about? Was that an immediate phenomenon that happened after you finished your seminary training?
No, so I was at the seminary, working with that embedded think tank there, and then I was hired away, to to be a department director at a think tank called the Acton Institute for the Study of Religion and Liberty, that is headquartered in Grand Rapids, Michigan.
Yeah.
And I had, when I was at Southwestern at the center there, my work was focused on designing programs that would deliver opportunities for students and also for graduates of the seminary, to have a forum to explore different ideas about how Christianity, um, informs the way that we should be thinking about the world around us. The Acton Institute works across religious sort of divisions. They work with Jews, Muslims, Christians, Catholics, Protestants, people who are non-religious. And so I worked there for 3 years. It was, one of the top 10 social policy think tanks in the world. It's an internationally ranked think tank. And so the organization that sponsored the Center for Religion, Culture, and Democracy is actually a nonprofit public interest law firm that's focused on religious freedom litigation.
Hmm.
It's First Liberty Institute, and so First Liberty has been around for more than 30 years, and they grew and decided that they needed to have some sort of cultural advocacy for religion, and they needed to have academic and intellectual advocacy. And I sort of fit the profile, and it was the perfect opportunity for me to bring my legal training, my theological training, my experience in the think tank world, and they came with the freedom to be able to design something that would be an effective vehicle for doing that, that fit into sort of like the larger picture of the type of work that they do. I mean, First Liberty, I don't know if you've heard of the Joe Kennedy, the football coach in Washington State, who
Sure.
was fired
Yeah, for praying
that he was our client. We represented him all
yeah,
the way to the Supreme Court.
sure.
So we have a pretty high profile when it comes to our litigation work. But then they wanted to engage, kind of in a holistic way in advocacy for religious people and the good that religious people and religious institutions bring into the public square. So that's where the CRCD was born.
That was where it was born. And that began, what year was that, Trey?
So I went to work for them in 2019, and we
okay.
had obviously a period of time where we were sort of putting plans together and whatnot. COVID hit, and then the CRCD itself was launched as a brand in October of 2020.
Okay, so you're brand new. You're about
Mm-hmm.
about 2.5 years old. Okay,
Yeah.
we're gonna take a short break here, Trey Dimsdale, and friends who are listening. We're going to take a break. We're having a very interesting conversation today with Trey Dimsdale. He's the executive director of the Center for Religion, Culture, and Democracy. We're going to talk a little bit more in detail about that, some of the things that you're concerned about when we come back. So, friends, don't go away.
The Hamilton Review podcast is brought to you by Hamilton Babies, 9 kid-friendly products designed for the little loves in your life. Find them at hamiltonbabies.com or amazon.com. Also consider Dr. Hamilton's recently published book, 7 Secrets of the Newborn, available at Barnes & Noble, your local independent bookstore, and amazon.com.
So, friends, welcome back to the Hamilton Review. We're continuing our conversation with Trey Dimsdale. By the way, he spells his name Dimsdale. He's the executive director of the Center for Religion, Culture, and Democracy. Trey, you call yourself civilization affirming. I wish I would have thought of that little moniker. I like this concept of civilization affirming. Tell us a little bit about what does that mean, and also I want to know. You've talked a little bit about your organization, but I want to know, what are you trying to achieve as well? But start with the civilization affirming. Start with that question.
Yeah. So a lot of times our politics ends up polluting the terminology that we use to sort of label our understanding of the world. And the terms conservative and liberal are oftentimes, batted around as simply being two different trenches, and people are either conservative or they're liberal, and they're left or right. And there's a particular unique meaning of conservative that the Center for Religion, Culture, and Democracy embraces and identifies. And this particular, understanding of conservative is a person is conservative. They understand their place in history. So you understand yourself. I mean, you yourself have committed your entire career, obviously, to working with kids and culture, and a person who understands their place as being the inheritor of civilization, an inheritor of institutions that they hold in trust for the future.
Yeah.
So that type of a person that takes that particular view recognizes that it's harder to build good things than it is to destroy them. You can destroy good things in a single generation, and we're seeing a lot of that happen in our society.
So true. So true. Yes.
The tradition and institutions that we have are actually not arbitrary. These are actually solutions to problems that someone in a previous generation has recognized that there's some sort of a clash, there's some sort of a division, there's some sort of a problem that needs to be solved. And this is how we ultimately end up with a tradition or an institution. And we should have a bit of humility in looking back at the way that things have quote unquote always been done, and not automatically believe that we need to reinvent things.
Yeah.
So we understand ourselves as having inherited a civilization that has had flaws. There are terrible things in the history of the West, even in relatively modern times. The lifespan of people, even that are listening to this podcast today. But those are things that we have an obligation to try to root out, but to make sure that we're not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. So we want to affirm those things that are sort of like the fundamental commitments, that understanding of the human person, that in understanding the human person influences our understanding of liberty, their own inherent dignity as image bearers. We want to affirm those institutions that are built around protecting those things. So our work is trying to encourage scholarship, encourage scholarship among academics, encourage college students to be thinking about those types of things, encourage people who are parts of popular audiences, religious leaders, to orient their thinking in such a way that they appreciate what we've received, and to work to try to slowly adapt it for changing times. Like, with technology and pluralism and the introduction of new demographics into our society, which are good things, but it has to be sort of managed in a way that keeps some stability, so that those institutions are able to survive.
Yeah, no, I think there's a certain amount of anarchism going on in the world, and in other words, tearing down to simply tear down, because what is this rage against the machine kind of ideology, where they just because it's there, you break it down because it isn't perfect. Okay. And there are a lot of things that are not perfect. The car I drive is not perfect, but am I going to run my car into the wall because it's not perfect? Not really, because I actually use that car to get around town. And and even though there are things that probably need to be fixed in my car, right now it has great utility. And I think that the culture that we live in certainly is far from perfect. But to wipe it out and to start all over again from scratch would be not a good idea. Certainly not a good idea in the short term for our children and our grandchildren. I certainly believe that with all my heart. Have you?
And when you look,
go ahead. No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, when we talk about quote unquote Western civilization, there are ideas that are in Western civilization that are unique. They're not a part of other systems. You don't find it in the Islamic world. You don't find it in those parts of the world that haven't been touched by Christianity, basically. And the simplest illustration of this is the way that we talk about rights. Our political discourse, no matter whether you're on the left or you're the right, whether you're on the extreme, whatever extreme it may be, we are talking about rights and our disagreements on how you define those rights and the political solutions to maximize liberty, or what types of liberty should be maximized.
Right.
You don't have that type of language in other types of systems. And this all goes back to this idea of the intrinsic value of the individual who is capable of possessing a right, is entitled to certain rights. And so the best political institutions, the best social institutions, are those that are built up around preserving and cultivating rights as they're rightly understood.
Yeah, individual rights. Yeah, no, absolutely.
Exactly.
It does bring that sense of freedom and liberty, and those qualities I have to be taught. It isn't like they're not necessarily, we're not necessarily born with that sense of freedom.
They're not intuitional. They're not always intuitional.
No, they're not. I mean, people tend to want security and safety more than liberty, and that's something that people kind of go, "Oh, no, that's not true." It is true. It is true, and that's one reason why we have to fight back against institutions, or whether it be governmental or whatever, that guarantees security, because that oftentimes does impinge on this concept of freedom. Trey, I'm fascinated. You have commented in some of your literature that there has been, is obviously, we know this to be true, that a significant decrease in religiosity in our younger people in the country. I'm curious, how does that threaten our culture? If people are not going to church, they're not going to shuls, they're not going, they're not engaged in any kind of religious organization, how does that really threaten American culture?
So there's a lot of talk, and it's a controversial, aspects of our public discourse that get labeled as culture wars. And at the moment, it's probably pretty out of fashion to sort of engage in culture wars. I myself would not really think of myself as a culture warrior in terms of the way that a lot of people in the culture would describe it. But the reality is that culture is actually built on a religion. And that religion may not be Christianity or Islam or Judaism or Hinduism. It's actually a set of metaphysical beliefs about the nature of reality. And so when we have large portions of our population who abandon any kind of a logical, coherent system of understanding the nature of reality, that ultimately means that their moral reasoning becomes unmoored from anything that's stable. So when you have a culture war, because culture is built on these religious ideas, these metaphysical beliefs about the nature of reality, you really don't have a clash of cultures as much as you have a clash of religions. And there's a way to do pluralism quite well. I believe that in the United States, we need to accommodate people that are of all different types of religious persuasions. We need a plural society. There's no such thing really as sort of like a Christian nation in the strictest sense. We shouldn't have laws that are mandating that people follow the Christian faith.
Well, I think that, that's an interesting point, and I think it's important to make that point, that when Christ was on earth, it was probably the last thing in his mind that he would have been thinking, that he was going to be building Christian nations. You talk about the individual, he was here dealing with individuals. And I think that when you see, certainly as someone who reads the Gospels frequently, Jesus is pretty much, a lot of his ministry was dealing with individuals. I mean, the woman at the well, Lazarus, his disciples, he dealt with crowds, but he wasn't a guy who, he also, many of the examples of his healing, for example, the woman who had the hemorrhage for so many years, who touched the hem of his garment, that was an individual. The guy on the other side of the Sea of Galilee, who was living in tombs, he was out of his mind. That was an individual encounter. And Zacchaeus, who was up in the tree. All these stories are really stories of individuality. And so, this is a very important idea that, Christ himself, when he was here, he wasn't necessarily trying to, in fact, that was one of the things that some of his disciples, I think, rued, the fact that he wasn't here. He wasn't on a power trip at all.
Yeah, he had the opportunity to seize power. But he, in fact, if you remember in the Garden of Gethsemane, he resisted Peter's attempt to assert violence and willingly went to his death. And that's not necessarily a model of leadership, I think, that's always appreciated. But when we look at the way that Jesus engaged the world around him, it's not some radical passivity, but it's also not it's the employment of a different set of tools than we would instinctively use to force our view onto the world.
Yeah.
And we will be much more effective as a church, as the church, as Christians, by using the set of tools that Jesus himself used, rather than trying to use other tools that that Jesus would not have used, or Jesus resisted the use of, for sure.
Yep. No, there's no question about that. So, how what do you think this trend of straying from religiosity in our youth? What do you think is at the heart of that trend?
Well, there's a new book out by Stephen Bullivant called Nonverts, and he's a British social scientist who's exploring the phenomenon of what we call the rise of the nones, N-O-N-E-S, the people who are religiously unaffiliated. And what's unique about the U.S. is that we have historically had such large percentages of people who may or may not have been practicing a particular faith, but at least they identified with a faith. And one of the most disturbing things that he's discovered is that 44% of 18 to 29-year-olds who have left the faith have left it not because they have examined the faith of their childhood and found it wanting. They have come to the conclusion experientially that religion is actually a destructive force. And so they're not simply stepping away from a religious identity or religious practice. They are actively rejecting it and see religious people and religious institutions as things that do not belong in society, because they see them as oppressive, or they see them as destructive, or distractions, or a drain on resources. They don't want churches to take up blocks where you could have a tax-paying business. So ultimately, these are not people who are going to value religious freedom when they are voting, serving on juries, taking leadership positions in communities, and that is ultimately, a threat to religious freedom. It's a threat to religious institutions, and beyond just simply the tragedy of individuals that are leaving families that have been religious for generations, or leaving institutions that have invested in them, Christian schools and churches and Christian colleges and things like that. And I think as a church, not one unified church, obviously, unfortunately, but we need to be thinking of ways that, how exactly has our posture with regard to the world, or our posture with regard to young people, been something that has made us better known for what we're against than what we're for.
Very
and
interesting. Yeah.
Jesus was not in the business necessarily of mincing words, but he also came to say he came to bring life so that you may have it abundantly. That's a positive mission. He wasn't coming to abandon something or to burn something down.
Yeah.
It's a positive vision for what can be by being a part of the covenant community that he himself established.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that CRCD tries to do, is we are trying to cast a positive vision for what the world might be like if religious institutions, religious persons, religious ideas are welcomed into the public square. And instead of being afraid, we need to have a posture of confidence.
Yep.
We can enter into the public square and enter into debate if we believe that we actually have the truth. There's nothing actually that can defeat the truth. There's not an argument, there's not a position that is going to ultimately be able to undermine it.
There's a scripture that says, "Oh, taste and see that the Lord is good." And
absolutely,
and that is there's no question that that is so true. And you see that obviously generationally. You also see it individually when you see people who carry their faith, and you see that inner joy, if you will, that they have. Trey, I'm going to change the subject a little bit. You're back in right now. You're coming to me from Calvin University in Grand Rapids, Michigan. You're there for a conference, and the I guess the center of the conference is around a book by C.S. Lewis called The Abolition of Man. Can you, in the last couple of minutes of our conversation, can you kind of speak a little bit about what you're doing and what exactly is the abolition of man?
Yeah, so it's the 80th anniversary of the publication of the book. It's a series of lectures, actually, that Lewis gave, and it's one of his most brilliant works. Most people are probably more familiar with Mere Christianity. That's probably more read popularly, but The Abolition of Man is not an academic book. It's where he lays out um, a vision, like a certain perspective on anthropology, understanding man, but also a natural law perspective, demonstrating that there's a certain internal logic that's universal.
Yep.
For being able to understand the order of society and the place of man in it and the value of man. And so this particular conference, we are co-sponsoring with the Henry Institute at Calvin University. It's directed by Dr. Michael Watson, who's a political science professor here. And we've convened a group of scholars from around the world who are writing using Lewis's work as a jumping off point to talk about how his perspective influences economics and how his perspective influences church life, or how his perspective intersects with all manner of things that we would be, we should be concerned with. And this is just one of the types of things that we do to try to, we're encouraging scholarship. These papers will ultimately be published. And, hopefully those things are things that trickle down into programs that we do for students and we do for pastors and for others.
It's good stuff. It's very good stuff. Well, Trey Dimsdale, you got a busy life and you're doing some wonderful things. And I have to say, I'm impressed. How do people find you out there?
We have a website, crcd.net. And then there's another website that is the home of one of our most successful high-profile projects. That's Religious Liberty in the States.com, and that is an index that we do that ranks the 50 states in terms of free exercise protections that are enshrined in state law. I hate to tell you, California, you won't be surprised, it's number 47 of 50. Lots of room for improvement, but CRCD.net has a lot of information about the general programs we're doing. Religious Liberty in the States.com has the rankings, a map that's interactive, a lot you can learn about the profile of religious freedom in your own state.
It's a good thing. It's a very good thing. So CRCD and is the .net or .org? Is that
it's
correct?
.net.
.net. Okay, .net. You said that. Okay, well, Trey Dimsdale, we're going to end it there. I just want to thank you again for taking the time from the conference there in Grand Rapids to come and spend some time with us today on the Hamilton Review. You're an amazing, very deep-thinking individual, and I wish you the very, very best. Godspeed to your vision. I think it's a worthy vision, and I hope it catches fire back there and here in California too. So thanks for being here, Trey.
Thank you very much for having me. I've enjoyed it.
And friends, you have been listening today to the Hamilton Review, where kids and culture collide. Until next time, be safe, be well, be encouraged. Bye-bye.
You have been listening to the Hamilton Review, where kids and culture collide. Thank you for allowing us to be a part of your day. Tune in again next week on Apple Podcast. Rate and comment and tell a friend.